Lord Chamaelion and his butler. Did I invite them? You may welcome them in, and four of them I'll be out in a minute. In the meantime, please introduce them to Braylon, Celine, and Silver. You would do well to remember that we are all your servants. It is not typical for any of us to behave as though we are friends to you, let alone to outsiders. We treat them with respect, and they want nothing more than necessary to do with us. Who cares? London cares. Don't tell me you haven't noticed the sideways looks Lord Chamaelion has been giving you whenever you're at his estate and you go to help a servant with one of their tasks. One time, a maid looked like she was having some trouble carrying a large vase, and nearly slipped and fell while doing so. He offered to help her carry it. Why did it matter at all? Everyone knows where you come from, but if you break too many norms... If Lord Chamaelion had an issue with my behavior, I'm sure he would have informed me of it. Besides, apparently we are to be hosting him now. If he should need anything, or I begin to talk about one of my servants, I believe he should know them. They are my friends. A groan of annoyance, one that would, under any other master, result in the culprit being sacked. You're killing me. Oliver had been sitting in his study for the majority of the afternoon, bored out of his mind. There was nothing, for once, of importance to do. There was a lack of assassins working on the word of someone with an old grudge attempting to kill him. There was a lack of his servants being rowdy and causing unnecessary mistakes. And a lack of chess. He supposed he could read a book when the initial boredom started, and so he had picked one up. Come late afternoon and he'd finished it already. He spent about an hour sitting with his thoughts about what he could possibly spend the day doing. He stood up from where he'd been sitting at his desk in his study. Cassius, who had been standing near like a bodyguard, and occasionally disappearing to check on the unnaturally quiet servants, gave him his attention, seeing that it was apparent Oliver suddenly had intent to do something. I want to pay Lord Emmett a visit, he declared. Victor had been over to his own estate so many times since that business deal had been made between them. He'd gotten very familiar with the building and staff, so familiar that during dinner he'd watch Victor help his maid pour the wine, or whenever the chef set the kitchen on fire, Victor would rush to help clean it and offer to help cook dinner himself. Really, these events were very telling of the fact that Victor didn't come from a life surrounded by servants. Because despite the Chamaelion servant's shortcomings, Victor did not make the mistake of assuming that such shortcomings equated incompetence. Oliver had 4 servants: Cassius Valentine, his butler who was unnaturally competent in all things cleaning to body disposal; Martha Lydon, the only maid of the estate who was rather clumsy but a decent worker; George Taylor, a not-so-competent cook, if the fires were anything to go by, and Liam Smith, the young groundskeeper. While perhaps not the best at mundane chores, they got the job done easy enough, and they were skilled at other things, like pistols, rifles, blades, and the like. The choice between those who can shine a shoe until it reflects its surroundings, or those who can make sure you live to see another day, is quite the no-brainer once you begin to ponder it. Should I send word, through letter or otherwise, to him of our arrival? Cassius followed Oliver out of the study. He guessed the answer to the question accurately enough, due to the fact Oliver was wasting no time in preparing to go for a trip in the ever-grey weather. Lord Emmett hasn't been one for formalities. Oliver shrugged carelessly. Cassius would have to take Oliver's defense at this moment. Victor had made an appearance at their estate multiple times unannounced. Never for business, always for leisure. Cassius would always watch him, watch how his eyes were always flickering around the room, perhaps to examine any possible instrument that could be used as a weapon, and then also to map out an escape route should he decide to commit a crime there. However, the peculiar thing about Victor's eyes wandering through the room was that they always did so for much too long. Too obviously. Even Oliver had noticed. Victor was not in search of a weapon or escape, but instead was simply admiring the room itself, whichever he was in at the time of this happening. Victor was such a curious man. Cassius had seen firsthand how humans who had so much to lose could act when faced with losing it all. But Victor simply did not have intent to murder Oliver. He had said himself that he thought losing it all, the consequence of his opponent following through with their blackmail, was the obvious choice over taking the life of a single person. The trip to Victor's manor was much shorter than many trips Oliver and Cassius had taken in their lives. Beyond the woodland so many feared, due to it being contaminated by Victor's presence, was a manor similar in size to the Chamaelion's own. Oliver wondered curiously about the contents inside of the building. Lord Emmett didn't seem the type to live like royalty. Marie Emily, who Oliver came to learn was the name of Victor's ever-looming maid, met them out in front of the building, in the courtyard. Whoever handled the landscaping seemed to have a passion for flowers. Marie greeted them politely. "We were not expecting your arrival. Please come in," She led them inside. Please wait here while I inform Lord Emmett of your arrival. And with that, she turned to walk away. Oliver took this time to analyze the interior of the manor. It was almost comforting. It was as though a small, cozy little home had been expanded into the size of a manor. The wallpaper, the wooden boards, the floor, carpet, paintings, design. Lord Emmett must have gone out of his way to hire those underappreciated in their artistic practices to complete the look of the manor. He certainly seemed like one who appreciated the arts, and furthermore, life itself. He doubted Victor ever wasted a dime on something he didn't need. Perhaps an occasional book or pastry, never more than that, though. Eventually, Marie returned empty-handed. She had her hands politely folded in front of her. Lord Emmett will be present momentarily. In the meantime, he insists upon you being introduced to his staff. A moment of silence, and Marie hadn't moved an inch. Oliver looked at Cassius before looking back at Marie. Will you not be doing so? Perhaps he was confused. Marie's expression did not change. I have no intention to. Oliver's jaw dropped a little, so blatant, nearly comedic. Lord Emmett has irritated me this afternoon. Should he desire to play friends, he may do so himself. Oliver pressed his lips together to keep from asking questions. He couldn't even perceive what Marie was doing as disrespect. She and Victor had never behaved in a way typical master and servants do. They always behaved more as friends than anything, maybe even siblings. If not for the stark contrast of appearances, he might be able to be convinced that they were indeed related. Marie seemed to have not been raised the same way Victor was, much more well-versed in the common manners of the upper class. She had scolded him, in front of Oliver before, for distracting his staff, or for attempting to help them do their jobs, for breaking normalities. Oliver didn't care much, but he could imagine the situations Marie must have had to help Victor worm his way out of because he couldn't conform to the life of a non-fly. Oliver had so many questions for Marie about her and Victor's relationship. I apologize for the wait, Victor announced himself as he hurried down one of the 2 large staircases in the room that connected to the upper floor. I had no idea you'd be coming. How wonderful it is to see you. How are you? He was beaming, taking his place standing beside Marie. Oliver grinned. Very well. He did not apologize for the intrusion. Victor would most likely tell him not to bother with doing so if he did. And yourself, you seem rather preoccupied. I was working on a new piece, actually, Victor explained, but waved the topic off. But enough about work. He looked around for a moment, then his brows furrowed, and he crossed his arms, turning to Marie. Did you not introduce them to the staff? Marie hummed. Must have slipped my mind. Oh, you are so childish, Victor huffed, before sighing and standing up straight. Well, this is your first time visiting, he addressed Oliver and Cassius. Why don't I give you both a tour? That would be much appreciated, Oliver nodded in agreement. He was curious to see how the homeliness of the manor continued throughout the ever-winding hallways and needlessly large rooms. The hallways were as beautiful as the entry room, and as Oliver was shown every room, he realized something peculiar, the large sizes of otherwise small rooms. There were rooms where the extravagant size made sense. Oliver had been right to assume Victor enjoyed the occasional book, as he had a large library that was probably bigger than Victor's own bedroom. Oliver couldn't tell you if that was true or not, because Victor had neglected to show them his room. Oliver was sure he knew which door was his as he strode right by it without so much as a glance. Victor had his secrets, if him being blackmailed said anything at all about it. Oliver couldn't help but wonder if his room had something to do with it. There were other rooms in comparison to the library where the large size did not make sense. The phone room, for example, was very simple, but unlike the smaller box-like hole in the wall where they had the phone in his own manner, Victor's was probably 12 by 12, enough to fit a comfortable chair and whatever other pleasantries one would need in the phone room. Very spacious, Oliver commented. Victor grinned. I'm glad you noticed. I can't stand the feeling of being in a small space. He began to walk off, but Oliver did not follow quite yet. The feeling of being trapped. Oliver wondered so much about the mysterious Lord Emmett, frightened of small spaces. That's not something you should reveal to anyone, truthfully. Especially not to Lord Chamaelion, of whom Victor had been blackmailed into needing to kill. Would he ever do so? Who knew? But now he's confident all Cassius would need to do is lock Lord Emmett in a small cabinet and let him suffocate to death while preoccupied with the anxiety flowing through his veins. I don't suppose anyone likes feeling trapped. Victor looked back at him. Come, I believe Silver will be in the next room. He turned around and gestured for them to follow. This entire time Marie stayed silent, following wherever Victor went, and stopping wherever he stopped. Oliver could accurately guess that Silver was one of Victor's servants. Victor was strange, Marie even stranger. What would the servants of the Emmett household be like? Oliver was welcomed into the room he assumed was the kitchen. It was drastically different from his own. All of the stoves and ovens were seemingly functional, but there seemed to be a countless number of windows that would light the kitchen up if the sky was not the color of stone. That didn't seem to deter the plants that had grown into the kitchen. Oliver's face scrunched a bit. Plants bring bugs, surely. He wasn't sure how fond he'd be of eating a meal here. Leaves broke through the edges of the windows, clinging to the brick wall that grew mossy in different corners. The tiles of the floor were splitting apart to make room for the flowers that had grown in bunches between them, and Oliver, correct as ever, spotted a bug. What an... He held his breath for a moment and forced a smile. Interesting kitchen, he managed. He wouldn't eat a single thing prepared here. He'd never tell Victor that, however. Victor laughed joyously, his hand on his side. Something about the laugh sounded almost like the air was being forced from Victor's lungs, like he wasn't allowed to laugh, or like it hurt to do so. There's no need for that face, Lord Chamaelion. This is simply the old kitchen, he beamed. You see, my late wife had her own personal kitchen where she loved to do her baking without the hand of any servant. She refused to let anyone cook in it. And one thing my wife adored was the garden. Victor gestured his hand out to the far right of the room, the opposite end of where the door to the room was. There stood a younger-looking man, dark pale of skin and wide black kohl for eyes. His hair was black and curly. You could tell that the man planned for a haircut soon due to how often he was adjusting his curls. Not by his face, because he wasn't making a single expression other than one of simple being. Oliver was staring intently, waiting for him to blink. This man wore the outfit of a butler, but had on thicker, sturdier gloves than the ones that, say, Cassius wore. He also had a rubber apron that was tied around his waist and neck, with various gardening tools in the pockets of the apron. He had been tending to a blossoming fruit plant that was growing from one of the sinks in the kitchen. Despite the messy task the man had been assigned, he seemed almost like a machine, and the exact opposite of someone who'd be good at gardening. His movements were stiff, and he had still yet to blink. This is Silver Hendry, Victor introduced Silver, who bowed politely. I've had him begin a garden here in my late wife's honor. He loves gardening, so this is the perfect arrangement, you see. Silver, this is the Earl Oliver Chamaelion. Oliver gave a polite nod in the direction of Silver, not wanting to shake his hand due to the dirty gloves on them, and also not wanting to get too close because, quite frankly, Silver was off-putting. How do you do? It's an... Silver's voice sounded almost scratchy. He cleared his throat, yet to blink. It's an honor to make your acquaintance, he said, clear now. Forgive me, I never have to speak much, he explained, before blinking and then lifting his eyes to Cassius. He then looked at Marie for a moment before he turned back to the task at hand. Victor led them out of the room, and as they walked down the hallway, Oliver pondered the interaction. What an odd fellow, he thought. He was at least glad that Silver had blinked before they left, and his gaze lingered on Cassius, almost suspiciously. Could Silver know what Cassius really was? Victor never behaved off-put around Cassius, almost strangely comfortable, and Marie hardly ever spoke. What would transpire if the truth were to be found out? But Silver didn't seem the speaking kind, so perhaps, for now, they needn't worry about such possibilities. The next room Victor showed them was the dining room. It was dark, not lit with even a single candle. The most light that was in the room was coming from the open door, and even then it didn't illuminate much. This is the dining room, Victor announced proudly, extending his arm and hand into the room in the direction of the shadows. This is Celine Blancard, he introduced. Oliver just stared blankly ahead. He couldn't see anything in the room. Victor looked from the shadows to Oliver, then to the shadows, then Oliver again. Oh, right, silly me. He turned back to the room. Celine, could you move into the light? They can't see you, he requested politely, as opposed to ordering his servant around. A younger girl stepped into the light. As fit for one supposedly living in the dark, her skin was as pale as a ghost's. Her eyes were entirely white, with no iris or pupil that Oliver could make out. Her hair looked white as well, though the color was difficult to pinpoint in such desaturating darkness. She wore a maid's uniform, her pin-straight hair pulled back in a ponytail, but despite her very ghostly appearance, she beamed at them. It's a pleasure to meet you both, Celine exclaimed, her voice not needing preparation to speak the way that Silver's did. She didn't seem quite bothered by Cassius's presence either. I'm setting the table for dinner. Will you two be joining us? It didn't surprise Oliver that Victor's servants ate with him, but rather... setting the table. In the dark. Oliver was thoroughly flabbergasted by Victor's staff thus far. Light hurts my eyes, Celine explained. I assure you that the lights will be on by the time dinner comes around. But then, how do you eat? With a veil. How strange. Victor led them away from the room, apologizing to Celine for interrupting her work before doing so. Finally, it appeared they'd gotten through all of the important places of Victor's manor. This being so, they ventured outside of it to meet his final servant and to also observe his extravagant garden. There was a tall, darker-skinned woman that was waving at them from the end of a stone path in the garden. Her hair was brown and fluffy with bangs. She wore neither a butler nor a maid uniform, but instead clothes Oliver could typically see on working-class men. A simple, airy shirt and pants, all of which were covered in green or brown. The woman ran over to them, coming to a halt right in front of them. "My name is Braylon Piper. I'm the groundskeeper here." She removed the glove of her right hand and offered it to shake. "A pleasure to meet you." Oliver smiled, shaking her hand. "Finally. A mostly normal individual in the manor." "Oliver Chamaelion, the pleasure is mine." It felt off to be introduced to the servants of a household as though they were family members or friends. Most of the time, he only learned about servants by their masters calling them by their names, not through introductions. This was unusually casual. Almost like London did not exist here. They were somewhere else. Braylon's eyes lifted to Cassius, and her smile did not fade. She looked at Victor. "I like how all of your friends are always freaks," Braylon noticed enthusiastically, before running back off to the task she'd been doing. Oliver was stunned. Freaks? Did he and Cassius look odd at all? Oliver looked like a perfectly regular nobleman, and Cassius a servant. Victor truthfully made sure there was never a dull moment in Oliver's life, didn't he? Whether it was distracting his servants to play a board game with him, or if it was the impending possibility of Victor's attempting to kill him. And now, it was a machine working on the garden in the kitchen, the walking ghost setting the table in complete and total darkness, and the groundskeeper enthusiastically calling them freaks. "Oh, don't take offense to it," Victor offered an apologetic smile. "She believes everyone's a freak." He waved off the comment, but Oliver was not convinced. It was more so that Victor was dismissing the comment because he did not want to have to truthfully explain it. Oliver wasn't too sure if he wanted to stay for dinner, thoroughly weirded out by Victor's staff. But he said nothing about the fact, the walls of the manor halls turning into the walls of the dining room that he could now see, seated at one end of the not-so-very-large table. Victor was seated across from him, his servants, all except Marie who stood behind him, sitting on the sides closest to him as they ate. Oliver ate silently, glad to eat his food now that he knew it wasn't being prepared in a kitchen bugs called home. Celine wore a black veil over her eyes. What a strange bunch this group was. Victor appeared so painfully normal compared to them, and Oliver thought he'd been strange. He felt as though there was a heavy air above them all. Cassius and him hadn't had much alone time at all to discuss the staff, the manor, or Victor. After Oliver finished his food, he decided to speak. It felt proper to do, and he thought about how blunt Victor had always been as he spoke. "You all are extremely strange," he commented. Everyone stopped eating, and then everyone began to laugh. Even the mechanically stiff Silver. Victor still sounded like he was being forced not to laugh too hard, but Braylon's laugh was hearty and loud. Even Marie had smiled a bit, as though relieved. "Well, certainly," Braylon chimed. "If Victor made quick friends of you, why would you believe the ones he keeps close would be any less strange?" Oliver blinked in surprise. "I don't believe I'm anywhere near as strange as you," he objected. "You have a shadow about you," Silver pointed out, his face stoic once more, once the laughing ceased. Oliver looked back at Cassius, who'd been standing behind him. Cassius looked back at Oliver and gave a simple shrug. It was the gesture of, well, what can you do? There was no point in denying something that even they knew was partially true. But very strangely, Oliver did not feel like the servants were judgmental of that fact. This group was entirely stranger than himself and his butler. Oliver felt almost at home here. Like he fit in. He didn't even care at all to counter the comment that he had a shadow about him. He couldn't care. This felt safe, a society of weirdos, freaks. And Victor and Oliver, the most normal out of them all. Perhaps Marie, too. She was the closest to Victor. She must be the most dangerous. "What makes you say that?" Oliver asked, not in denial of a shadow, but rather curious as to how they all came to what appeared to be the exact same conclusion. Victor smiled. "Oliver, the lack of Lord Chamaelion should have bothered him, but it didn't. This was like as though they were close friends." "My staff are far more observant than I. Such a thing is easy to spot." Oliver didn't know what to say. He didn't have any reason to be defensive or to care, because it didn't matter here, not under the Emmett roof. Dinner came to an end, and Oliver was seen off by Victor as opposed to Marie this time. During the carriage ride back, Oliver reflected on the evening. It almost felt like a fever dream. "Well, that was certainly eventful," Cassius said cheerfully, after deciding Oliver had had enough silence and time to process the Emmett manner. "Indeed," Oliver sighed. He had so many questions unanswered. "What of the Emmett household? Do you think together they could pull off a successful stunt to kill me?" He mustn't forget that tiny little detail that is the reason why Victor and Oliver ever made acquaintance to begin with. He knew Cassius would know more than he himself could by first glance. I am more than confident that they could. Whether or not they would, however, is a much different story, Cassius reported. No poison in the food, Oliver murmured to himself. And no trace of hostility, Cassius added. I suppose for now, little more needs done than to continue to be cautious. Oliver could forget that he had ever been bored to begin with earlier that day. He was sure that if he continued to keep the company of Victor, he'd scarcely find boredom present in his life again.